including civil society, have to play their role. And so this is a little bit the topic that we want to explore today. And I want to start out, first of all, asking panelists, from their perspective, what are critical success factors to mobilize the private sector, whether it's the finance or whether it is in playing other roles for these sustainable development goals, a very big agenda. And ideally, if you could all think about what is your most important one. So rather than listen
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. I think first of all, when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, of course we understand the idea of SDGs. In Indonesia, we thought that infrastructure development will be the area in which private sector can give the significant contribution. Of course, they are not just acting as a contractor doing some projects in infrastructure, but more importantly, we would like to ask more involvement of private sector as investor in infrastructure project. And of course, we know very well about the emergence of PPP, public-private partnership, and I think we need to enhance the role of PPP because the P here, public, aside from the private, I think is very critical. The way the private sector can be contributing to the sustainable development, it has to go through the public sector, and this public sector would be private sector partner in developing, let's say, infrastructure for efficacy in the world. So I believe PPP should be still at the focus when we are talking about the role of private sector. But again, from public sector perspective, at least from my background, planning perspective, we need to lay out clearly which project should be done with PPP scheme, which project should be undertaken fully by the government budget. So by having this kind of selection, we hope that the role of private sector will be maximized. So I think that would be my initial reaction to your question.
Okay. Susan, from your perspective, what do you think would be a critical success factor for mobilizing the private sector for the SDGs?
Well, I think, first of all, we should think about the private sector broadly. So there's the private sector, meaning foreign investors and foreign companies bringing money to the table. But there's also the private sector in developing countries. So the work we've done in Africa points to the critical role that large domestic African companies are playing. So, and then there are, of course, small firms, entrepreneurs and startups. And indeed, in many countries, the majority of job creation which is necessary for inclusive growth, in fact, comes from small companies. So first of all, when we talk about the private sector and development, I think we need to think more broadly than developed country investors and companies. And I think for any private sector actor, investment climate is critical. Whether you measure it by the Doing Business indicators or other measures, having clear regulations, clear tax policy, reasonable court systems, rule of law, these things, access to finance, I was around there, are just critically important in any country for any private sector actors. Now, if you want to narrow the question to what I've heard a lot of talk the last few days at these annual meetings about leveraging private sector funding for development and for meeting the SDGs, then I think it's a narrower set of conditions. One is to, first of all, just have the bankable projects, have projects that have clear revenue streams, that have attractive risk-adjusted returns, and often, as we know, in fact, in low-income countries, the risk profile versus the returns just isn't there. And so that's when the new products that can be developed by the IFC and other MDBs become very important, whether it's first loss type products, products or loan guarantees, political risk. Those things are going to be essential if, in fact, we want to go, as the saying goes, from billions to trillions of dollars for development.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, Hungary, from your perspective, small medium enterprises, women, and as a matter of fact, Susan spoke about the domestic private sector, not just the foreign direct investment. How do you see them come in and work towards the SDGs? Do they understand that they have a role in that?
Thank you very much. Yes, SMEs play a key role in achieving the SDGs. If I focus on the African continent, 90% of businesses in Africa are SMEs. And if I go down a layer lower to look at what percentage of those businesses are women, about 20 to 25% of those businesses are led by women. But yet, there is a well-known fact that there's a huge gap in their ability or access to capital. It is estimated by the IFC at about 20 billion. But yet, for me, the SMEs, and in particular women, play a critical role in us achieving the SDGs. What we're finding as opportunities in the market are women businesses that are looking at employing more women, bringing more women into their supply chains. For example, a lot of the agri businesses, which are agro-processing businesses that are run by women, they're looking to source their inputs from women small-scale farmers. And when you put more money into the hands of women, and when you give them that economic decision-making power, that translates into benefits to their communities and to their households. So we, as an investment and management company, are very focused on supporting the growth of SMEs with this gender diversity lens, because we believe that we can also have that impact without having the financial trade-off. Again, quoting from McKinsey, when you have more women in a business, those businesses tend to outperform their peers. So for us, key is focusing on how do you invest in the economic potential of women, because that will then allow you to have that impact on the SDGs.
Pat, from your perspective, and you can wear either the World Bank hat or the fund hat.
Sure. Perhaps do a bit of both, but let me start with the Abraaj hat. I think there are three things that we need to do to bring more businesses and more investors into a lot of the markets we care about that will achieve the SDGs. The first thing I would say is articulate the opportunity. And what I mean by that is we often look at all the deficits or all the challenges. Let's be really clear. The Business and Sustainable Development Commission, which is a group of CEOs and civic leaders that were convened by the UN, recently put out a report identifying $12 trillion of opportunities that are created through achieving the SDGs, $12 trillion. That's an extraordinary amount of money, extraordinary amount of opportunity for businesses around the world. And so really articulating that and making it very clear what the opportunity is, I think is hugely important. I'll just offer two other things along those lines. One is that we talk not about emerging markets, but about growth markets, because that is where the growth is. And if you look across the world, you know that OECD countries are getting doubled in terms of their growth rates by so many countries where the World Bank operates, IC operates, and so on. It's where the population growth is, it's where the economic growth is. And importantly, when it comes to the SDGs, as you see these rising middle classes and this increase of urbanization, you have to realize that 80% of people's income in most of these markets are going to go in four areas: food, housing, education, and healthcare. If there's not an opportunity for businesses to come in and try to provide those services or some component of them in partnership with government, then business people are just not seeing the trees in front of them. So number one, articulate the opportunity is all of our role. Number two, I would say, in terms of where government sits, I think it's important that we support private capital as opposed to trying to steer private capital. That is a very hard horse to drink. And I think very often we look around and we say, well, this is the area we want more private investment or we want more businesses to go. I think a more productive route, and I can talk about this in the Abraaj context later, I think the more productive route is to say, where are people headed? How do we support them? How do we look to partner more effectively so that we can accomplish some of the goals hand in hand with business instead of determining it? And then the third thing I would say, and I don't want to go into this in part because Susan touched on it, is policy stability. People talk an awful lot about political risk in a lot of the markets that Abraaj invests in. We would argue that really what people are looking for is policy stability. It's so important for banks, for example, to get money to SME businesses. Well, someone is not going to invest in a bank or recapitalize a bank or grow a bank if they're not sure where financial regulations are going and if things are likely to change in the near term. So policy stability, which is not the sexy stuff, but it's really important. Strengthening institutions, strengthening ministries are hugely important to develop the confidence that people need to take advantage of those opportunities I articulated earlier.
Yeah, great, thank you. And thanks for making that link between, the risky markets, but also the opportunities, and then people have to start thinking about those differently. So I'll ask Peter, from in IEC, how do you say, like, here is the key, the silver bullet of how we can bring the private sector into addressing the SDGs, or is it somewhat more complex?
IEC is, of course, all about silver bullets. just to mention that a couple of weeks ago in New York, on the margins of the UNGA, Abraaj organized an event for private sector impact investing. Fund managers, institutional investors of all sorts. This was, I think, just 5 years ago. That would have been surreal in the United Nations context to have Wall Street and others there talking about how to invest into the SDGs. So we've actually come a long way in terms of private sector and SDGs. The SDGs provide a framework which is now even taken up, a framework for all of us, public and private, to anchor our activities in this space. IFC invests with the private sector. We invest roughly $20 billion, including mobilization right now annually. We're building a framework for project assessments that provides a clear line of sight to the SDGs. We would want to invest with the private sector in order to achieve SDGs. So this is something that is in the making, which will provide incentives here and a way of orienting our investments and to work with our clients. Critical factors, very similar to what has been said already. It's important that the environment is right. When the policy environment is distorted, we can get counterproductive results, be it for the climate, for the environment, or for inequality. We need to work on the environment in which business invests so that business can do what it does best, follow the demand. Secondly, we need to assist the private sector in particularly risky environments, in environments in which there is low capacity. We can do so, and MDBs can help, the official sector can help. We have all received instruments in the past few years that enable us to do this better. And then finally, we should tap into the enthusiasm for SDG and impact investing, and have recently, this year, IFC launched a social bond, which is specifically directed at pooling investments into high-impact SDG type situations.
Excellent. So we have quite a bit mix of different things, from very specific areas, infrastructure, PPPs, to creating a level playing field, but also creating a much greater sense of the opportunity and that there is growth in these countries, and in spite of the risks that one can and should be investing there, in order to link both the small entrepreneurs and startups to markets, as well as enable sort of international, large-scale multinational companies to invest. Let me go into a second round of questions and sort of explore a little bit more. And again, I'll start with Bambang, because he will actually have to leave us a bit earlier than the others. Indonesia is a fantastic example of a country that has grown very rapidly. It's being one of the it's not the tigers, but the
small tiger.
The small tigers. There you go. It's a tiger, a baby tiger. And when you look at how the World Bank Group has played a role, and I don't know whether you want to follow up on your example of PPPs and infrastructure, and then you think of what's coming, whether it's the SDGs that have created the framework, as Peter was saying, but then also there are new challenges, whether we are thinking about the whole digitalization, the change of the market, that will really demand that the labor force changes, etc. How do you look to the World Bank Group or other multilateral development banks, and what you will be asking from them? Is that going to change, and do you see that the institutions are adapting to that changing context?
Yeah, I think World Bank Group, as other multilateral development bank, has a very good position to support the transformation of a country, to support the sustainable development goal. So let me take the example to continue what I've just mentioned in the earlier part about the public-private partnership in infrastructure. Of course, you now have the bank itself, the development bank, World Bank, you have the IFC, and you have MIGA. I think those three, at least to my experience, have been complementing one to the other when it comes to enhancing PPP implementation in member countries, in this case Indonesia. I remember, of course, the bank itself gave some kind of capacity building to not only bureaucrats but also the domestic companies to be participating in PPP. So basically we are trying to lay out the structure of PPP in Indonesia, fully supported by World Bank and also other MDBs in Indonesia. And then you have IFC. And IFC, I think, is in very good position when we have the challenge to attract FDI in infrastructure coming to Indonesia. Of course, we don't expect IFC to do all, to invest, let's say, in one specific project with 100% equity ownership by IFC. But we expect IFC to be there, and then they will bring other potential investors, especially from private sector, private equity, as well as big companies, to be part of the infrastructure investors in Indonesia. And I think I'm very sure if IFC is there, at least the question about internal regulation in Indonesia, maybe the question about business environment in general, I think will be declining. Of course, we still have to tackle all the problems, all the issues in our own country, but at least IFC will be the one that attract, potential inflow to infrastructure. And don't forget, you have MIGA as well. And MIGA, at least, when it comes to PPP, can provide as a, co-guarantee with the government. Of course, government will have to provide to some extent the government guarantee. But with the existence of MIGA, and we do sometimes the co-guarantee, again, it will attract potential investor to participate, to bid for any PPP in infrastructure in Indonesia. So I believe World Bank has everything. They have the experience, and of course they have the credibility from private sector point of view, and that really helps Indonesia. And when we are talking about the future, mention about digital economy and everything, I believe World Bank and IFC, if I remember, have a very good role when we first identify that microfinance is very important to support financial inclusion and to support entrepreneurship. And I remember at that time, since World Bank already mentioned the importance of financial inclusion, IFC right away invested in some of our banks, Indonesian banks, and those banks now becomes like the champions of doing or channeling microfinance to young entrepreneurs in Indonesia. And as a country, we need more entrepreneurs and we need more private sector involvement, and that's how the World Bank Group can support their member country.
Yeah, thank you. This was really an excellent example of how it's not just one service, but it's a combination of different services across the spectrum from capacity development, investment climate, policy reforms, mobilizing actual deals, and bringing in the guarantees. This is exactly how the idea of the World Bank Group as a solutions bank group should be functioning, or the catalytic role. Very, very good. Thank you for that. Anne-Marie, when you think of SMEs run by women and thinking about the challenges that they face and what they have to overcome, market failures that need to be addressed. So of course your fund is helping them, but when you think of an IFI, World Bank Group, African Development Bank, as a partner, how would you see the different roles are, and how can an IFI help you in that process, in achieving, getting women's economic empowerment?
First, let me just start by sharing a little bit on what we see as challenges, and then I'll talk a little bit about perhaps how we can address those. So when we talk about growing or supporting SMEs, everybody thinks about finance, that this is what they need, is they just need finance. Yes, that is part of the problem, but it's not the whole problem. What we're seeing with respect to women-led SMEs is, yes, the capital is important, but they tend to be very conservative in the manner in which they're running their business. So it's very much entrepreneur personality driven. And so what they also need is the ability to see beyond what they're currently doing, so to be able to see the other markets in which they can expand their products to. And it's really about helping them with the strategy, the skills to kind of come out of their box and understand what the opportunities are for them to grow. When it comes to them accessing finance, what we're also seeing is that there needs to be a change in the way in which one deals with this particular market segment. I recently read an article by, I think it was by Harvard, where they had interviewed VC investors and the perceptions that they had of women-led businesses versus men-led businesses. Women-led businesses tend to be young and dynamic, but the young and dynamic is, they don't have a track record, whereas when you look at a male SME, it is young and dynamic, but in a more positive way. So I think there's a lot of perception issues that women SMEs are having to deal with. There's a certain level of shyness to deal with the financial sector, particularly with private equity, with fund managers. There's the network. It is true, there is an old boys club, and just providing that platform for women to network, to showcase, to come out of their shells is also very important. And I'm not suggesting a women's club. I think it really has to be diverse. It has to be integrated because to grow these SMEs, you need that gender diversity. We're seeing a lot of initiatives in the market, and I think there is a role for the World Bank Group to support more women fund managers, to support some of these accelerators, these incubators, to help these businesses become investment ready. I think there's also a role for catalytic funding and for patient capital. So those are some of the issues that I think would help address the problems.
Okay, so on one level, really sort of supporting the technical abilities, but then we need to think about how do we work with perceptions and how women entrepreneurs are being seen.
Yeah, I think it's part of the whole ecosystem. We can't look at it in isolation. We need to look at what is in the ecosystem. We need more women fund managers. We need more accelerators that are focused on women. We need more catalytic funding. We need the policy environment to be more favorable and supportive. We need the mentoring and the coaching. So I think it's a very holistic approach that has to be addressed.
Okay, great.
Let me turn to Susan. From your perspective, and your research portfolio is very interesting, economic development, labor markets, productivity, competitiveness, especially in this day and age where really there's so much change happening. And when you look at that in combination with the challenges of achieving the SDGs, do you think that we are focusing, when we are thinking of private sector and the SDG agenda and the focus on how do we raise funds from them, are we capturing really all of the critical aspects? Are there other things that are more promising or even riskier, where we should be thinking about and saying like, well, are we going to get there, or are there risks that we are blindsided to?
It's a great question. I think that the private sector clearly has a very important role to play in achieving the SDGs, but I think that we need to go down several layers in more detail from that. So when you look at where private sector investment goes today, even when we use a word like infrastructure, well, there are a lot of different types of infrastructure. So private sector investment is more common in transportation, roads, airports, telecom, and energy. Much less common in water in developing countries, and that's because in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, 70% of water is either unmetered or leaked or essentially stolen, so there's no revenue model. So I think that when you think about the SDGs, they are very broad, they cover a lot of different things, and I think that private sector participation could be very strong and even a leading role in some elements. And there are going to be other elements of the SDGs that are going to be a much tougher fit. So when you think about education, less clear what the private sector role in providing education is. Healthcare, I think, is split. Clearly, you can imagine private sector investment in hospitals, but when you're talking about public health, probably not. So I think the first message would be we need to think more critically about which gaps can the private sector fill and which ones won't they fill. And for the MDBs, it's interesting because it would mean that your portfolio over time would actually shift. And with the private sector, being leveraged in some types of investments, but not in others. I think beyond that, it is important to realize the private sector can't do everything, particularly foreign investment. Domestic resource mobilization in developing countries is going to be incredibly important for meeting the SDGs. Both public sector through tax regimes, but also just through developing the financial sector. So again, focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, it's like today I added up the total amount of outstanding loans, bonds, and equity market capitalization in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's about $2.5 trillion worth of financial assets. And of that, about $1 trillion is provided by foreign investors. So less than half is actually coming from foreign sources. So continuing to tap into domestic pools of saving and having more widespread financial inclusion, bringing many of the 2 billion unbanked adults around the world into the financial sector is actually going to be an incredibly important, I think, move over the next 10 to 15 years to raising funds for development. So overall, look, I think there's a big role for the private sector, but I think we should be realistic and targeted in where we think it will be most successful.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Let me ask you, Matt, and maybe reflecting a little bit on the difference between how the World Bank Group or the World Bank functions as an institution, because here it's like within the World Bank Group we have a different culture in the bank, we have a different culture in IFC, and now you're in a private fund. Are we speaking the same language? Are there certain bridges that we have to build in order to bring the private sector into the conversation and meet in the middle and identify areas? It sounds to me like that everybody is excited about the SDGs and seeing opportunities, which might be the vehicle, or is there something else that we need to do?
I think we're on the right path. To Hans-Peter's point, we've seen a huge shift in the way people talk about investing around the world. And part of this is driven by search for yield, and in a low-interest environment, people are looking to a broader set of opportunities out there to get the returns that they want. But part of it, very importantly, is the articulation of the SDGs. And part of what we've seen at Abraaj, but also what I saw when I was at the World Bank, and I was back in Addis just 2 years ago, is the SDGs are really providing a vocabulary and a framework that many, many people are embracing. So I think we're on the right path here. I think where we need to go from here is on realizing that we're all really interested in solutions. And we talk an awful lot about partnership capital at Abraaj. And the point there is, let's figure out how we can best partner, who needs to be involved. So one quick example is we have a healthcare fund that is partnered up with the Gates Foundation, Medtronic, Philips, and then us as a private equity firm, because we realize each one of us brings something to the table. IFC, incidentally, is an investor. So you think about the suite of actors that I just mentioned. That's a very powerful collective that have real experience. And what we've realized, and I think what a lot of others realized, is that no one's going to do it by themselves, but you need to think about ways we can truly partner and leverage one another's talents. So the one final thing I'll say on that is I'll actually disagree with Susan. I think there's an awful lot that private players can do in public health. And the reason I say that is one of the things that we've been able to do is screen about 40,000 people for diabetes, hypertension, NCDs in East Africa in the last 6 months. Did it much more cheaply than the government could do. And what's important is that, sure, that helps our hospital networks in knowing how to focus their time and energy, but it means also now that the health ministry and others have a better data set for understanding exactly what's happening among their population, and therefore others can think about what the real need is and where they ought to focus their time and energy. So that, I think the point is that an awful lot of us are really invested in the success of the SDGs, and so long as we remain thinking about partnerships, and so long as we acknowledge that a lot of other people are really looking for those solutions, and we're all solution partners, solution providers, I think we're coming together, and there's real opportunity going forward.
Picking up on that, and you were mentioning a group of important people who are investing. I see on the screen, and thank you very much to everybody who is contributing questions. The question about bringing in some of the richest people in this world and how we could mobilize them to participate in this. Maybe if you could speak from Abraaj's perspective, and then Hans-Peter, maybe you can speak about from the IFC perspective.
Sure, I'll touch on this very quickly, and I know Jeffrey Sachs has been making this point for a while. If you can access the top several hundred billionaires, you have this enormous pool of capital and so on. I'll go back to my earlier point. I don't think that's the path to go down. Again, it's very hard to steer the capital. Let's support the capital that's out there. Going back to the opportunity I'll mention, right now there are about $9 trillion in negative debt held by institutional investors. I'll say it again, $9 trillion of negative yielding debt means an awful lot of institutional investors have looked around and said, I want to guarantee a loss on my money. How can that be if you're a fiduciary? But the point is that I think what we need to do is illustrate the opportunity, make the case that there is a lot of money to be made in many markets where perhaps people haven't been invested so much, and then see what portion of that $9 trillion will say, all right, I see the opportunity now. Humans love stories, right? We consume stories, and I think we need to tell the story much more effectively about how we can make money, how we can succeed as we solve these fundamental human challenges that are out there that the World Bank and so many others have been grappling with. So I think we need to spend some time. It's perhaps a little softer than the World Bank normally thinks about this, but we need to tell that story, and we need to convince people of just what the opportunities are, and then some of that money hopefully will flow in the right direction.
Let me turn to Hans-Peter and especially this new approach that the World Bank Group is pursuing. Some refer to it as the cascade. And could you talk about what's new about that, how that sort of taps into, expanding partnerships, as Matt was saying, or, for example, there's a question in terms of the knowledge gaps, in terms of what works, where, how, why. Does the cascade speak to that? What are the thoughts of the World Bank Group going in this direction?
Perhaps worth kind of describing what the cascade is and then situating it within the broader objectives that we have.
So the cascades at a project level is a set of questions that we are committing ourselves to asking. When we get a project proposed, we ask, is this a project that needs to be done in the public sector? Is this a project that could be done in the private sector? What are the conditions under which this project could be done in the private sector in a sensible way, meeting all the objectives and the standards that we have, limiting contingent liabilities? If we can create these conditions, is this maybe still too risky for the private sector? Are there ways to de-risk these operations? So we have a set of questions that around projects that are meant to test where it is that the funding should ideally come from, where it is that the project solution should ideally come from, or could sensibly come from. We can also take a sector view of the cascade, and I often prefer that actually. In the sector view, we ask these questions that Bambang has really very, very well illustrated. If you look at the development of the power sector, what are the elements here which public support, public financing is particularly well suited to provide? The regulatory environment, policy, supporting policy changes. But then you can also ask, what is it that the private sector can provide? Well, power generation is something which usually, given the right conditions, can be done in the private sector today. So there is a complementarity here. You can design a PPP, but it requires a lot of work on the public side first in order to enable it. So there is a complementarity, there is an enabling dimension to what the public sector can do and how the private sector can come in. Why do we care? Well, we want coming out of the enormous SDG challenge that we have, we want to maximize financing for development. We all see McKinsey has calculated them, others have calculated them. We see these enormous gaps in financing. And we know that the public sector, the public institutions, the NDBs, are not going to be sufficient to fill these gaps. The private sector has to step in, and it has to step in big time. This is the conclusion with which, Caroline, you started at the beginning today. This is really one of the key and novel premises of the SDGs. Now, but that means that given the scarcity of public funds in view of the challenge, we need to make sure that we use these very precious public funds where they are really necessary. And there are a lot of areas where you can only work with public funds or where the private sector would not do a good job in meeting requirements. So we want to focus the public funding where it is required so that we maximize the impact we can have and can bring the private sector into areas where the private sector is capable of acting. So that is the general idea of the cascade. It is something which, following the example that Bambang has given, we have been doing for many years. This is not novel in its own right. When we discussed the cascade in the World Bank Group in the course of this year, we've come up with many examples of where this is happening. The power sector is a particularly good example, which is happening in many countries. But it is true also outside, in agribusiness, for instance. Working in the agribusiness sector requires a framework of standards, phytosanitary standards, which the public sector would help create. The capacity there would be created by the public sector. The trade logistics would often require an intervention by the public sector, and the private sector can invest in the agribusiness itself. Those are the complementarities that we're looking for. So we just want to take these practices, which we have had for a long time, we want to take them and make them systematic and ask these questions in a systematic manner. That is the core of the cascade approach. And just to take also issue with Susan, sorry for that. You were saying, you were talking about primary education. We've actually just looked at primary education in a country where 20% of primary education was provided by the private sector, and apparently really quite well, and there was a lot of appetite for increasing that. More generally, education and health is often de facto privatized in many countries, and because the public sector is unable to provide it. And then we need to look at whether we can ensure that it is provided to a good standard, and whether we can support the private sector in doing that, where the public sector is incapable of doing it. So there are actually complementarities even in areas in which one might not perhaps at first sight look for them.
So what I'm hearing is really creating an enabling environment that makes it attractive for the private sector to come in, but as Matt was saying, like, you can't take it and sort of make it invest in something. Now, when we look at one other aspect of today's world, and that is there's been a big backlash against globalization, against the private sector sort of like taking maybe too much of the center stage. How do we think this will work out, and how can the private sector demonstrate that it is making genuine contributions to a broader good rather than pursuing just sort of like profit orientation? And I don't know, Matt, do you want to start us off, and then we'll take that question around for everybody?
I'll just make one simple point and then turn it over to my colleagues who may have more to say. And that would actually be to say, I think the phenomenon you're describing is very much a North conversation. In terms of South-South investing and what we see in an awful lot of the markets where we operate, there is not that same backlash against globalization. You're seeing actually some of the few places where there's increased capital flows. Now, we know cross-border capital flows have been reduced dramatically in the last 10 years, but an awful lot of that is the Western banks that have pulled back and some of the Western investors. But on a South-South basis, I would actually argue there's a very different dynamic going on right now, and there are many who are taking advantage of that pullback on the part of some of the more traditional investors and businesses, and are saying this is the opportunity for us to think more regionally, for us to think more about how we can actually expand. And the final point I'll make is it's one of the opportunities we see as we invest with, let's say, very strong companies in a particular region who are looking around, in a particular country, are looking around and saying, how do I become a regional player? Or how do I become a global business, even if I'm based in Lagos or Jakarta or somewhere else? And that's a new phenomenon, so I think we have to really specify where some of those trends are having the impact and where perhaps there's a different dynamic at play.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Susan, from your perspective, and if you want to rebuttal any of it.
Well, we can continue the debate about what kind of private sector money goes where. Glad to hear that there are some opportunities in even primary education. I would say, look, I agree that I think that the backlash against globalization is felt much more keenly in the United States. And in Europe, where you've had loss of jobs due, frankly, in large part to technology, but also to global trade. I think that when you look at developing countries, I mean, the private sector is where growth is, like kind of full stop, right? Public sector productivity doesn't really increase. So when you talk about raising living standards and having more GDP per capita, it only comes through productivity growth, and that comes through private sector enterprise and innovation and investment in R&D. So I think that the message should be that, look, the private sector is essential to growth. You're never going to achieve the SDGs if economies don't grow, and grow actually fairly rapidly. That's sort of a precondition to even hoping to achieve in what are, really aggressive goals by 2030. And then the second point is, I think that we've talked about many examples of, it's not necessarily the case that private sector interests and attaining the SDGs are at odds. In fact, we've talked about now many ways in which they're actually in harmony, and even in things that I might be dubious about, like primary school education in a poor country, turns out that there is a private sector player who can make a business model out of that. So I think that actually the range of these stories actually illustrates that you don't need to think, it's not a zero-sum game. A successful private sector entity, if it's achieving its goals towards the SDG, then we should be happy with that.
Bambang, building on what Matt was saying, in maybe the South, maybe in Asia, it looks differently. How is it in Indonesia? Is there a backlash against globalization, or more a fear that if the US and Europe are turning around against globalization, that will affect also your economy?
Yeah, I think now, of course, we are watching what happened with the trend of the so-called backlash to the globalization. But in our case, we would like to focus first on how we, improve ourselves, domestically. And again, talking about the role of private sector and public sector related to SDG, I would like to I would like to see from different point of view. Of course, we are talking about environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and social sustainability in SDGs. In my opinion, the role of private sector is basically to complement the public sector. And if we try to categorize each one of these sustainability issue, for environmental sustainability, I think it will be shared between public and private sector. Private sector can always be active in renewable energy, for example. But public sector will have to take role, for example, in our case, in forestry issue, because this is not more a private sector issue. But for economic sustainability, I think this is the area in which private sector will play a major role. They can do a lot of investment for anything related to the economic sustainability, and it could be just a simple private investment, or it could be done also through public-private partnership. For social sustainability, the issue of inequality, the issue of poverty, the issue of hunger, health, and everything, of course, public sector has to be in the front. They have to play a major role. Private sector, of course, can be participating, but almost, at a limited scale. So at the end, we can see that for each part of the sustainability, public and private will be complementing each other, meaning that there is no issue that private sector cannot contribute to SDG. They can, because public sector cannot take all, 100% the roles to achieve the 17 goals in SDG. So I think that's my position. And again, back to Matt's statement about investors now look worried about low yield environment. So I believe when we are talking about economic sustainability, especially in emerging economies like Indonesia, this is the area in which private investor can look for a little bit higher yield environment, because again, we are still growing, the population is still big, consuming class, the middle class is getting bigger. So this is an area when we can promise so-called higher yield. So private investor can come to emerging economies, they complement our public money in order to achieve all the 17 goals in SDG. I think that will be my position, and I have to apologize that I have to leave the room for another event.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you. Let's maybe let's maybe continue. There is a competing event starting soon somewhere else, so but thanks for those of you who are staying with us in this discussion. I would like to actually continue along these lines that Bambang has just set us out, and he started with that as well, the sort of like triangle of sustainability. We're not just simply talking about financial or economic sustainability or environmental one, but, or social one, but a combination of the three.
Now, Bambang spoke about that from a government perspective. Anne-Marie, from your perspective of SMEs, do they see themselves in that triangle, or are they primarily in one area or the other? And maybe related to that, are there sort of market failures, obstacles to them being able to work across environmental, social, and economic dimensions that could be addressed either by governments or by MDBs in their work with governments?
Thank you. First, I'd like to express that there is a sort of consciousness of change that we're seeing in our markets in Africa around this issue of impact, of social and economic impact. Starting from a high level, the Africa Venture Capital Association has a committee that looks specifically at sustainability issues and are beginning to track across our industry the impact that private equity is having for jobs creation for women, etc. So there is that consciousness of change. And then coming down to the enterprises, what we're seeing particularly among the small enterprises is more of a social consciousness. So it's, I guess, the social entrepreneur and looking at the opportunities that their markets represent to serve poor households, rural households, etc. So I'll give you an example of a business that my partner invested in, which is an Uber of domestic workers in South Africa. And what this business does is it connects domestic workers, so particularly women, poor women living in townships, to employers living in urban areas. And what this does is that it formalizes an employment, providing these domestic workers with rights, and providing the employers with some protection in terms of identification, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're finding entrepreneurs that are seeing failures in the market from a social, economic equality perspective and finding the solutions from a business perspective to address those failures. So that's really very exciting. But these social entrepreneurs are clearly challenged because they're passionate in what they do. They are faced with a lot of regulatory barriers. If you're looking at growth, our markets tend to be small, so growth strategies need to be regional. The logistic problems, cross-border problems, just getting your product to market. We're working with a designer or an individual who runs a fashion business, and he's trying to aggregate designers across different countries onto an e-commerce platform. But getting goods from one market to the other, if you're going to use this e-commerce platform to aggregate designers, is a real challenge. So there are certainly an important role for government and for the World Bank Group to begin to address these barriers to growth.
Maybe let me turn to Hans-Peter and ask, in many of the contexts of the World Bank Group, we look at these as in the World Bank it's safeguards, in the IFC it's standards, right? Environmental and social standards. Do you feel that private investors that the IFC typically works with are sort of thinking of this more as a standard, a requirement, and I will be a bit provocative, a burden to them that they have to think about the social and environmental impacts of their investments? Or are they really coming around and saying like, well, actually the Sustainable Development Goals are both a business opportunity, but they generate, a value added that goes beyond, just having a profitable company?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think generally speaking, working with the IFC is not sort of a simple and hassle-free process for firms to go through. So if they come to us, they know that we're not the fastest. We go through all these due diligence steps. We look at the standards. We would work and insist on establishing certain standards and mechanisms, management practices, perhaps, audit boards or whatever it is in these firms in order to be able to work with them. That is different from when they go to a commercial source of finance, which is usually not going to ask this kind of broad range of questions. So it's kind of built into, there's a self-selection here. If they come to us, they would usually be willing to put up with that, and they would sometimes actually seek that out. There are firms, quite a few, that wish to demonstrate that they are able to meet these standards, and where the association with the IFC is a proof of concept. And that is valuable in the markets in which they invest. It may be valuable in their funding market because more and more banks are beginning to look at these issues as risk factors as well. So I think my answer would be mixed. I would suspect that the fact that firms work with us tends to show that they are actually interested in adopting these standards. But yes, they will consider them as a burden as well.
Yeah, so maybe that is a frontier where turning that around and making these companies realize that market leader role and the value added that they can generate by meeting these triple sort of requirements for sustainability might be an opportunity to explore. I saw on the questions here something that we've been talking about, investing in general, private sector in a very broad sense, whether it's big companies, funds, SMEs. But a question up on the screen here is asking about fragile, low-income and fragile countries, and whether actually in those contexts investments can really be de-risks. And so maybe, Susan, I see you're nodding. Have you done some research on that? And what would be your take in terms of really helping the private sector grow? In IEG, we've seen that quite a lot of countries are really focusing on how do we attract foreign direct investment to come in, rather than how do I build first a fabric of local entrepreneurs. Is that something you've come across?
Yeah, as a good economist, I'll say, well, the answer is yes and no. You can't actually destroy risk. In fact, there are many theorists who say there's a given amount of risk in the global economy, and all we're doing is shifting it around as to who holds it. And the relevant point for this conversation is that's what we mean by de-risking. Basically, the public sector or multilaterals taking some of the risk, taking a slice of the risk from an investment so that a private sector investor can actually feel comfortable that the risk-adjusted returns are going to be attractive for their business. But on the other hand, I think you actually can, in the context we're talking about, reduce risk. So going back to the policy advice and the very critical point about helping governments get certain stable, good policies in place, whether it's regulations over the sector that the investment is taking place in, pricing, these sorts of institutional and regulatory changes can actually lower the risk over the life of the project. And that is critically important, and it's where the MDBs play a unique role in being able to help governments enact good policy and build the institutional capability within the government itself to be able to carry it out and continue it. So I would say, yeah, you both shift around the risk and maybe remove some of it.
I was going to say, if I could actually pick another question here that's come up. The question is, to what extent should governments use tax policy to encourage private investment? And the thing I want to say about that is an awful lot of the conversation that I've heard this week is about how we get more private capital into these markets. Clearly an important issue, and clearly it's one that Abraaj thinks an awful lot about. But the other piece I think we need to remember is the goal of tax policy, the goal of government policy isn't just to attract more investment. We have to remember that the second half of the billions to trillions equation, which doesn't get nearly enough time and attention, is domestic resource mobilization and is proper tax collection. So you get an awful lot of markets where you have 10 to 12% of GDP is collected for taxes. In the U.S., that's closer to mid-20s. In most developed markets, it's closer to mid-20s. If we can get tax schemes in a lot of countries that are more consistent, more rational, not so determined by connections or industry biases and all the rest, you'd have billions more dollars that governments could use to build their own infrastructure instead of trying to go and incentivize private sector to come in and do the infrastructure for them. So I just think that as we have this conversation, we have to remember the end goal isn't necessarily to get more private players, though that's important. The end goal is to deliver on the SDGs, and there's an awful lot that governments can do themselves if they focus on that side of the equation. So I just wanted, before we kind of lose the whole discussion, remember that's hugely important, and I really hope that more people are talking about it outside of the conversations I'm having this week, because I'm just not hearing nearly as much on that side of the equation.
I think that is definitely, sorry, my microphone doesn't always work. That definitely is an extremely important aspect, and when you look at, or when anybody looks at the billions to trillions paper, it's very clearly said there is the domestic public finance angle in there, and the resources have dramatically increased over the last couple of years. And in many ways, this is a nice segue to the last question I really wanted to put. So in our conversation, we have in many questions and answers explored how the public sector has to play a catalytic role. Now we know that in many countries it doesn't sort of work and come together. What would be some suggestions, and maybe we go around from one to the other, from your perspective? Is there something where I could say, like, well, thinking about playing the role in a different way, thinking about combining how the government functions in a different way, that it can be more catalytic and create a better enabling environment? Or is it just a matter of let's continue doing what we've been doing and try harder to eventually create those enabling environments for the private sector to come in? Can I start with?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for that. I just want to also pick up on the second half of that question, which was about de-risking, which was on disruptive innovation, and tie it to what's the role for the public sector. I've done a lot of work in financial inclusion, and in fact with UK Aid on their financial sector deepening funds. And part of the work we do is actually provide soft money to encourage private sector to be disruptive, to actually encourage them to take the risk, to try innovative approaches to achieve financial inclusion. And as we all know, the fintechs of this world are being very disruptive and challenging our way of thinking around banking. So I think it's important, there's an important role for the World Bank and other development institutions to provide that soft funds to support those innovators in the market that are disruptive, and I can give many examples in other sectors. But at the same time, we need to be able to educate our policymakers. So the work that I've done recently, where we are engaging with the central banks, and they also need to be disruptive in the way they think and view the markets. And just, I guess, at 2 o'clock there's a session at the IMF building on fintech and the role of regulation. And so I think it's important that supporting the private sector does require support to the public sector to better understand the changes and the disruptions that are happening in this market. And I think we have to remember that technology particularly in Africa, is going to allow us to leapfrog many things. And we have to ask ourselves the question, does the government, does the regulator understand this technology and how to actually regulate it? And so I think it's an important aspect that we have to think about.
Yeah, so just continuing as usual is probably not really an option. Hans-Peter, from your perspective, how would we work with governments in a different way to ensure that they can enable the private sector, whether domestic or international, can play a role?
I was discussing, we were discussing the cascade before, and I mentioned that it's a way of doing more systematically what we have been doing before, but perhaps not quite as consciously. As part of that, we are trying to develop a more programmatic approach here at the IFC, one that is not just reactive to financing demands, but that looks forwards into the medium term and tries to identify what needs to happen in a market in order to enable the private sector to function and to invest. So it is very much part of our strategy to do this differently, to do it more systematically. We have developed a tool, private sector diagnostics, which we have now piloted in Kazakhstan and in Ghana, and are rolling out in this fiscal year. We hope to be doing at least a dozen of these. And that is a tool which scans sectors in countries and tries to identify where it is that there are particular obstacles to sector growth, and then identify how the bank group, but perhaps also other players, including the IMF or national or other players, can work together to overcome these obstacles. We take a 3 to 5 year time perspective in that, because most things cannot be just resolved immediately, and if you take a much longer time perspective, you lose the sort of the private sector flavor of this exercise. We want to make it an exercise that is driven by private sector opportunity. In order to measure and gauge that private sector opportunity, you need to have a time horizon that isn't too far in the future. So the whole idea and the way we are structuring ourselves here at IFC, the way that the bank in the global practices is organizing itself in order to deliver this is a step forward, I think, from the way we have done it, which has produced lots of good examples again, but has not been a throughout and systematic approach.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Of course, as an evaluator, I love an analytical approach. But, very often the private sector is looking for opportunities, doesn't want to be directed, as Matt was saying earlier. So it's going to be an interesting tension to hold in order to get to the right place. From your perspective, what do we need to do different?
So what I would say is and I'm going to talk about the bank, and when I say the bank, I mean IFC as well. When I was on the board, we always tried to get staff to stop talking about them separately and say we're actually part of one entity with the same shareholders. So
it's a bank group, that's the language we use.
So since I'm sitting here, I'll focus on what the bank and its various operating units do. I think what it needs to keep doing, what you all need to keep doing, is what you've been great at over the years, and that is thinking about financial innovation and continuing to adapt so that you're putting forward products and tools that allow others to come in and see opportunities. Let me give you a couple of quick examples of what this building and this institution has done over time. It created the term emerging markets some 30 years ago and focused people on this set of countries, this set of markets that were really opportunities that were emerging and becoming bigger. That drove a lot of capital in that direction. Just in the last 5 to 10 years, it created offshore local currency bonds, Masala bonds and Panda bonds and so on. It's been a leader in harnessing the green bond movement and bringing more capital into thinking about environmental investment of various sorts. I'll go down the list. MCPP is a really innovative and creative way that IFC has recently begun bringing insurance companies into emerging market infrastructure because they've gotten some soft money from SIDA, the Swedish development agency, that has taken first loss, that raises the ratings, and now insurance companies can access new sources of alpha, if you will, new opportunities they couldn't do before. The pandemic insurance facility is a way of putting some money to work. Insurance is relatively cheap, which provides greater stability for an awful lot of countries that could get hit by pandemics. So my point is that there's a great track record already, and the question is, let's keep looking around the corner, let's keep figuring out what are the new tools, because what private sector investors and businesses are always looking for is what's out there. And so if we're inclined towards investing in certain ways, again, maybe not going to be steered, but if you're inclined towards certain opportunities, if you're inclined towards new, more diversified opportunities out there, you just have to create it, and often people will come in that direction and grab a hold. The thing you have to do is be okay with failing and realizing that some of these may not work. Now, I mentioned a number of successes. I'm sure there are tons of other things that I never heard about at the board, which were miserable failures, but that's okay. That's how this works. So that's what I would say, is keep doing what we've always been great at, and it will continue to have a major impact around the world.
Yeah, and really being a role model and catalyzed by leading by example. Susan, from your perspective, is there something that we need to do different to help governments create enabling environments?
Well, I think I'd build on what Matt said. Keep doing what you're doing, but you're going to have to do it at a far, far greater, faster, more agile scale. So today, for every $5 of official development assistance to developing countries, there's $1 of private sector investment. To go from billions to trillions, by definition, you're talking about $1 public money leveraging $10 of private. So you're going from 5 to 1 to 1 to 10. That's a 50x change. So I think the products are here, the ideas are here, but now it's doing everything at a much faster, larger scale than what's been done. So I think it can be done, but it's building on the successes and amplifying it in just a very massive way.
In many ways, that actually speaks to also this question that's on the screen here in front of us. I don't know whether, no, you all can't see these questions. And, okay. So somebody is asking about, the bankable pipelines, and this came up also earlier. So it's not just a matter of somehow generating a commitment and money, but, where are they going to go? And the question is what MDBs can do to better support preparing a pipeline. And I want to give Hans-Peter the opportunity to respond on behalf of the World Bank Group and the MDBs. How do we look at building pipelines and developing projects?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. We're talking about all the money that might be available to finance projects, but very often the real problem, the real bottleneck is the availability of good projects to invest in. And that is something that's been recognized in recent years as a very pressing concern. It's been recognized in the G20 context. There was the creation of several funds to support upstream project preparation. The Global Infrastructure Facility is one such response from a couple of years ago. We have all received, and I mentioned this earlier, we have received tools, funding tools in recent years, IFC, World Bank, others, that enable us both to work more hands-on with clients and governments in preparing projects and in working on the environment for projects and in de-risking projects themselves. So many of the tools that have been created in recent years have to do with that. So there's a recognition of it. Doesn't mean that the problem has been resolved, but there definitely is far more going on. We have a unit in our infrastructure area where this is a particular issue that is fully dedicated to the question of developing projects upstream in order to structure them in a way that they become bankable. So yes, I can say, can one do more? We probably will all have to do more and more of that in the future if we want to go from billions to trillions, because it is not just about the availability of funds, it's about the availability of projects.
Yeah. So we've got just 4 minutes left to go, so I want to give give each of you a minute to sort of like respond to part of the question that's on the screen. What would be the number one takeaway right now for the public sector and development actors in regard to the private sector playing a bigger role? Marie, would you like to start?
I really think it's about, the question there was government markets not working. I think the takeaway really needs to be around the understanding of the public sector about the value, the economic value that the private sector is bringing. And when you look at the SME sector or the financial markets, the microfinance, financial inclusion, it's really being able to educate them about the important role that the private sector plays. Yeah.
Susan?
The number one takeaway has 4 parts, but I think it's relatively straightforward, right? You need to invest upstream in bankable projects, so there's something to invest in. You need to develop the tools to take on some of the risk where appropriate to attract private investors. You need to then get the investment climate, regulations, and a clear, stable policy environment. And then finally, you just need to be agile and out there and fast to respond. And if the public sector and MDBs can do that, I think that we've all said it, there's trillions of dollars of money searching for yield.
Yeah. Matt?
I would say don't forget political will. Governments at a certain point have to do the hard stuff. Your judiciary has to be independent. You have to have a rational and consistent tax scheme. You have to do a lot of the less sexy blocking and tackling of being a well-governed country. And that means investing not only in your finance ministry, but also in your health ministry and on down the line. And if you do that, good things will start to happen. It's not always, A to B to C, but that is the number one job of government, is to manage itself, be effective, be efficient, and have high integrity, and that goes a long, long way.
Hans-Peter? Number one takeaway?
I think is that we have a pragmatic and evidence-based approach to what the role of the public and what the role of the private sector is. It's a debate today that is far less ideological than it was. It's based on track records that we've had over the decades now in development finance with public and private models. It's based on the mistakes that we've all made and what we've learned from them, and overall a more pragmatic questioning of what is the best solution for the problem.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. With that, I want to really. We started with...
I'm sorry.
Yeah. This way around. So with that, I want to really thank all of the panelists. Excellent discussion. I think we can all sort of sum it up in a simple way that it is a very complex interplay between all of the different agencies. There's not going to be, let's bring one in and that will be the panacea for all, but each party has to play their role, and that means from the SMEs, the local entrepreneurship, to the international ones, to the financing agencies, the government, and of course the international development partners. Thank you very much, very inspiring, good discussion. I'm sure many people have taken a lot away from it, so please join me in thanking the panelists. Great.
Can I give you a card early? No.